Welcome everyone. Can you hear me okay online? Thank you for coming. I'm not sure what time your time zone it is for people, but yes, thank you so much for coming to our event today. I'm Michelle Riedlinger and I'm going to introduce this event and give a few acknowledgements. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations people on the land where we're meeting today and where many of us here live and work. And I'd like to pay respect to the elders' laws, customs and creation spirits, and also recognise that this land has never been ceded. I'd also like to welcome our in-person attendees. We've got more than 200 people who've registered to attend online, and we've got a very dedicated group who've made this report possible through their contributions. As well as the authors of the report who you'll be hearing from today, you'll see a list of people here on this and in the second page of the report who've made this research possible. And I'd like to give a shout out to Jean Burgess, Oscar Tui, and I think Carolyn Gardam, who's meeting us online, who've supported this research. So thank you very much. Research of this kind across countries and sectors is expensive, and we'd really like to acknowledge the groups and organisations who financially supported the research. So QUT's Media Research Centre, great supporter, the Design and Creative Practice Information in Society and Social Change Enabling Impact platforms at RMIT, the Weizenbaum Institute for the Network Society and German Internet Institute, the Centre for Advanced Internet Studies, and the Global Journalism Innovation Lab, which is funded by the Canadian Government and supported by the Conversation Canada. And of course the Australian Research Council through TJ's DECRA and the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Automated Decision Making and Society, with the authors are affiliated. Big thank you to Kathy Nichols, who's here today from the ADM+S, and also Tal Hampton and Tia Bayer from DMRC for doing the work in the weeks prior to making this event possible. So thanks very much. We've had 2 summer schools. They've had their hands full, but they've been great responding to everybody and their questions. So, of course, we aren't the first group to study AI in journalism, and this report joins many recent reports on the topic, including the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, the BBC, the Tower Institute for Digital Journalism, and the Centre for Media Transition at UTS. But the report we're launching today has a distinct focus on multimodal visual AI, and it offers a bit of a broader scope over multiple domains, so looking at production, editing and audience reception and interpretation. And it also complements other survey work focused on AI and journalism, giving a rich picture, some nuance and depth, particularly in the domain of news audiences. And you'll hear about some of that work today. This report brings together 6 discrete research and engagement activities held over the last 3 years, and it draws on fieldwork in 7 countries, so Australia, Germany, US, UK, Norway, Switzerland and France. And it focuses on AI and journalism within 3 broad domains, and those are AI-generated content in journalism, journalist perceptions of and their use of AI, and also news audiences' perceptions of and reactions to the technologies being used in journalism. You're going to hear from each of the authors today about specific findings in the report. We'll firstly hear from Ryan Thomas from Washington State University, and he'll give a summary of the key findings. The leader of our team and DECRA fellow, TJ Thompson from RMIT, will give an overview of AI journalism use cases and audience comfort with those use cases. And soon to be Dr. Phoebe Matich from ARC Centre for Excellence, Automated Decision Making in Society will give an overview of the legal and ethical issues regarding news organisations' use of AI. And then TJ returns to present a series of questions for journalists and news organisations to ponder as they experiment with the technologies. And then we'll open up to some questions. We've done some timing, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. In good shape. So joining us from the United States, from Washington, is our collaborator Ryan Thomas. And Ryan, as I said, is from Washington State University, and he'll give a summary of the 9 key findings. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Michelle. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I am thrilled to be part of this team and grateful to you all in attendance for making the time to attend today. I would like to provide a very broad, sort of bird's eye level overview of the findings of the 6 different research outputs that, as Michelle mentioned, integrate AI content, production, and reception. And then I will turn things over to my wonderful colleagues who will provide a deeper dive into each. So first, consistent with prior research, we find that algorithmic bias can take many forms. If you can, there you go. Our work looking at how journalists and journalistic roles are rendered in Midjourney, for example, found that journalists tended to be depicted as white and male, with women shown less often. And there were other biases present, such as favoring the urban rather than the non-urban environment. As we know, these biases exist because of human biases that are embedded in the training data and source material, as well as the unconscious biases of developers. Second, we observe that AI tools and the models that power them are almost always frustratingly opaque. This is problematic for a profession that has traditionally prized values around transparency and verification and creates something of a policy vacuum, which I will talk about in a moment. Third, we found that the news workers that we interviewed were more comfortable with using AI for predominantly non-photorealistic illustrations as compared to using AI as a replacement of or supplement to camera-based journalism. They were also more comfortable with visual AI being deployed in certain parts of the newsroom, for example, features, design, or opinion, over traditional news content. And they also thought that smaller and less resourced newsrooms would deploy AI in perhaps riskier or more ethically challenging ways than would larger or better resourced newsrooms. This isn't necessarily the case, however, as we know that both large and small outlets are experimenting with AI in sometimes very public and audience-facing ways, as the technology appears to be becoming gradually normalized. Fourth, we find shared concern among journalists and audience members about the potential for AI-generated or AI-edited content to mislead or deceive. Participants would speak of difficulties in discerning what was AI generated as such imagery becomes increasingly sophisticated. They felt this created the potential for unverified content to slip in without them knowing. Fifth, we find, again, shared concern among journalists and audience members about the impact on human labor. Echoing previous concerns about the incorporation of technologies into newsrooms and their potential for the displacement of news workers, we identify broad concern about AI being used to cut costs and reduce the size of the workforce. Similarly, audience members expressed concern about the corresponding loss in quality that they feared would result from increased incorporation of and reliance on AI due to the absence of human traits such as curiosity, empathy, sensitivity, and so on. Both journalists and audience members expressed concerns about news organizations being increasingly unable to fulfill core journalistic functions, such as holding powerful interests to account. Sixth, we found a general absence of policies in newsrooms concerning generative AI, specifically, although we acknowledge that this is an evolving process. Journalists who spoke to us shared frustrations that such policies, to the extent they existed at all, lacked concrete guidance, while audience members felt that the absence of policies would invite suspicion and lack of trust. Seventh, we found shared concern about transparency concerning AI in newsrooms, or the lack thereof. Audience members felt that news organizations had an obligation to alert them to the presence of AI content, whether it was in video, still images, audio, or text, and to explain why AI content was used and to what end. Eighth, and relatedly, audience members expressed frustration about not knowing how much AI content they had been exposed to. Only a minority of our interviewees could state with confidence that they had encountered AI-generated content in the journalism that they typically consumed. Others expressed feelings of being suspicious or unsure. Some of the most commonly identified types of AI content that audience members could recall encountering included AI images, AI-translated reporting, and AI-generated weather reports. Ninth, and finally, audience members reported that their comfort level with the use of AI tools and processes was greater when they themselves had first-hand experience with such tools. For example, they felt more comfort about journalists using computer vision to identify subject matters in images and add keywords automatically rather than manually if they themselves had experienced similar when trying to insert an image into Microsoft Word or Microsoft PowerPoint. With that, I will hand you over to my colleague, Dr. TJ Thompson, who will discuss in greater detail our research on audience comfort with different AI use cases. Thank you.
Alright, thank you, Ryan, for that. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to discuss some of the use cases that either are being used right now in journalism or can be used in journalism. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. These are just a few examples of how AI is or could be used in journalism. The grouping names come from the Reuters Institute report. They've kind of had 3 different domain names behind the scenes: creating content and delivering new news and new delivery methods or means. The highlighted ones there in red are the use cases that we used in our research with audience-focused participants. So I think one of the nice things about our report and these use cases in particular that Michelle's already kind of foreshadowed is that we are primarily looking at multimodal or visual use cases. Oftentimes when you look at surveys of AI in journalism, either how they're being used in newsrooms or how audiences are reacting to how it could be used, you might get 1 or 2 survey questions about images or videos. How do you feel about journalists using AI to make images or to make videos? But there's so much, I would argue, nuance and complexity to different image forms, different image outputs, different ways to use images in journalism. So we highlight these here, 16 different ways to look at still images here, from trying to interpret what is in the image, to using it for storyboarding, in kind of a behind-the-scenes way, to editing images, to creating images in very different ways, from icons and color palettes, to photorealistic and non-photorealistic illustrations, to data visualizations. Really lots of different ways to think about images and a lot of nuance here. So we don't have time to walk you through every different of the 23 use cases in terms of time, but what I can do is I can share with you one example from each of the 3 domains that we used. So we had 3 domains like the Reuters team did. We called them slightly different things. We called our domains enriching and brainstorming, editing, and creating. I can give you an example of each of an example from each of those domains. And then in the last part of my section, I can talk you through, we have a little chart here that tries to visualize our audience members' comfort level with the different use cases across these 24 different examples. So first, domain brainstorming and enriching content. This is an example from that domain. Here, journalists can use software, if they so choose, to try to recognize image objects or features in images. And you can tell you there, for example, I think this is a cow or sheep, I think this is a water tower or a communication tower, and the percentage confidence that it has in its assessment. As a former photojournalist myself, I would spend lots of time after every assignment in the newsroom working through all the media assets I created, adding metadata to the images, to the assets, adding captions, keywords, labeling, all that kind of stuff. It took 30 minutes plus every time for every assignment. And looking back now, I'm kind of thinking that seems attractive to me to have a little bit of help with this kind of process, so I can spend more time out in the field, documenting things, chatting with folks, less time in the newsroom, doing the manual kind of laborious task of adding in metadata and keywords and labels and that kind of thing. I think oftentimes it's good to have a human in the loop with these processes, so it's not just like AI is running free and labeling things carte blanche, but having a little bit of an oversight so the human is in the loop and can check for accuracy of the labels. Second example, this one comes from the second domain, the editing domain. So here we have a historical photograph taken many years ago that's coming to us from the State Library of Western Australia, showing a ship. We can use AI to animate a historical image, to get a little bit more dynamism, a little bit more life, and perhaps to attract some more eyeballs into something that could be perceived as boring and old and historic and dusty. So 6-second little animation here showing you how you can use, for example, Runway, an AI tool, to give a little bit of motion and perhaps interest to an image like this. Now, in terms of comfort levels, I haven't mentioned those yet, but with the previous example, of the image recognition, about 76% of the audience that we chatted with was comfortable with using AI for feature recognition in news images, and that comfort level rose to 88% if someone had checked over the labels that AI created for the images. One really interesting thing is that we have some international comparative data in this project here. And so people in Europe who we were interviewing had interesting ideas about privacy. They have the GDPR in Europe, the European Union, a different approach to regulation than we have here in Australia. And they were curious whether if journalists are using AI tools to recognize image features, whether they would have to have the consent of people depicted to have their representations be processed by an AI under the GDPR. So interesting kind of idea about privacy there coming from our European data. In terms of the comfort level with the second example of the animation in journalism, I can give you the comfort percentage here. So about 60% were comfortable with journalists using AI to animate historical landscape if that doesn't show people. And the comfort level rose to 71% if the use of AI was disclosed. The third example here is from the third domain, creating. So in this case, we are asking AI to get some data that's already out there in the public domain and to visualize it for us in a chart. There's a separate use case that we have where we have a spreadsheet to image approach where the user is providing their own data in spreadsheet form and asking AI to visualize it. That's a separate use case. This one we're talking about here is existing data already out there in the public domain. So with this use case, we've asked a generative AI tool, ChatGPT, to visualize a country's population over a particular period of time. And it created for us this chart in response. Now, our participants had interesting, again, really rich, interesting ideas and reactions to these use cases. One of our participants mentioned how important the interval scale is with charts. Right now, we have a 4-year interval scale. Every 4 years, you get a new little plot on the chart that kind of creates the visualization for you. If you change that interval and you have, for example, 6 months, every 6 months, or every 10 years or 20 years, that slope is going to look drastically different, how steep or how gradual that slope looks. So the interval scale really matters. And I thought AI probably isn't thinking about the interval scale and how it's going to get perceived by humans, even if it's quote unquote accurate. So that's kind of an interesting thing there. Less than half of the sample, 44.6%, were unequivocally comfortable with using AI to visualize publicly accessible data. The percent of comfort increased to 83.9% if the data were checked for accuracy. And the remaining 16% uncomfortable because of concerns with accuracy or concerns with job or skill loss, e.g. that we're over-relying on AI perhaps, and that's leading to less skillful use of technology by humans. And then as promised, my last slide in this section is looking at an overview of these 22 use cases and comfort levels by news audiences with each. So we tried to hopefully helpfully color code the 3 domains here. So blue for enriching and brainstorming, red for editing, and gray for creating. So you can see the relative distribution of comfort across each of these 3 domains. So you can see here, the blue ones are more or less overall on average, audiences are comfortable with these examples. 66% or higher comfort level for the enriching and brainstorming use cases. With editing and creating, the overall average comfort level is around 46, 47%, and 44% respectively for editing and creating. So a little bit quite similar comfort level overall, but there's a really big divergence. With the editing example, for example, the domain, for example, only 11% comfortable with generative expand with the person, that use case, compared to resizing images, also using editing functions to resize images with AI, 88% comfortable. So there's a really big kind of divergence within domains for how comfortable or uncomfortable people are with these use cases. So with that being said, I will hand you over now to Phoebe Matic to talk about some of the legal and ethical issues that our research uncovered. Thank you, Phoebe.
Thank you, TJ. So what we uncovered in the process of talking to news audiences and to journalists is that there were some really interesting points of divergence in the legal and ethical issues that both groups identified. So I'm going to talk about these issues thematically and try and point to some of these divergences. So the first concern that was very, very salient for both groups was the potential of generative AI visuals to mislead. Journalists were particularly concerned that audiences were ill-equipped to distinguish between AI-generated and camera-generated images, or to pass misinformative content about well-known people or places. This pessimism was nuanced according to context, so whether or not an image was being looked at on a phone screen or on a computer screen. But they were also concerned that audiences couldn't necessarily identify misinformative content even when it was labelled that it was AI generated. What we kind of found was that these responses revealed each group's low opinion of each other in terms of how they would navigate this sort of content. Some of the journalists that we spoke to were quite confident in their own abilities about being able to identify AI content and less confident in audiences. Meanwhile, others were a bit more kind of skeptical about their own capacities. On the other hand, audiences were concerned that journalists might rely on this technology too much. This was particularly because they were aware that AI could fabricate sources, details, or quotes and lacked access to real-time data. And it could be also being trained on problematic content itself. So participants thought that AI tools existed to people please rather than to actually help journalists do journalism, and were concerned that outlets might publish or republish content without vetting it thoroughly. Secondly, journalists were next most concerned about human labour. This comes as no surprise to anyone who's been thinking about this, but what we found was that there was a lot of interest particularly in journalist management and editors, about cutting costs, and so they thought that some of their staff might be overestimating the likelihood of them losing their jobs. But in general, it was perceived that journalists who used AI tools more efficiently or helped news be more efficient would have the most success in keeping their jobs. One person that we spoke to, as we see here on the slide, was talking about how they currently pay a graphic designer. That costs quite a lot, and they're looking to minimise those sorts of costs. On the other hand, audiences were concerned that less journalists means not only putting people out of work, but also minimising human creativity and compensation for human creativity, and importantly also minimising journalism's capacity to hold powerful people and organisations to account. And if we think about the sorts of companies that are also engaging in AI tools or producing AI tools, I think that's quite an interesting comparison. Next, we had copyright. So editors and journalists this was their third concern, and they were particularly worried that models' non-transparent training meant that there was these implications for authorship. So there were questions about the attribution and disclosure of AI materials, especially supplied images that had been contributing to generations. And then there was also, this was more prominent for larger organisations, so those that were bigger targets for copyright lawsuits. And here we can start to think about the impact of regulatory pace. For journalists, for audiences, they were worried that journalists from the same news organisation might then be kind of plagiarising those from other organisations, especially if that content had been picked up by an AI model. So audiences were imagining how it would feel for one's sovereignty over their own work to be overruled or overridden. And this follows cases that have been publicised in Australian news media where AI generators have sourced or repackaged information published by news outlets. The next concern, detection, was not something that was salient for news audiences, so we can think about the relative exposure to this sort of challenge, But journalists were particularly concerned that they lacked tools to fact-check AI-generated content and that they were reliant on processes for verifying camera photography. And this includes things like comparison to other materials that are available or proof of provenance of a certain image. So journalists were reluctant to use images if their origins couldn't be verified, and there was quite a lot of interest in C2PA provisions, or Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is a form of technology about coding metadata. Next, it was really interesting for me, the 10th most salient concern for journalists was concern about the reputational damage to their professional legitimacy because they rely on representing the real. However, audiences were extremely concerned, this was the 4th most prominent concern, that because models are designed not to attribute information outside of the model, that this kind of means there's implications for human compensation and also for news outlets' transparency in disclosing the use of AI. So there are layers of transparency here in terms of AI technology and how it is being used in the news. And this was something that audiences spoke about far more than journalists. And lastly, it probably comes as no surprise, there was a major amount of concern about the potential of algorithmic bias in AI images, particularly in journalism, that AI models would propagate existing inequalities around race, sexuality, and ability based on both training data and the biases of people who are prompting those machines. And the concern was that even if you were prompting for diversity, the images might be imprecise, stereotypical, and generic. And this, trying to correct for this wasn't a guaranteed source of success. Meanwhile, audiences also raised that models are quite Anglocentric and historically and culturally insensitive, and access to them is also unequal. Audiences also expressed concern. Sorry, this was by a journalist talking about trying to get an image of their mother, and the image was still of a South Asian woman in a sari. And then audiences were concerned that they weren't able to pass the ideological bias of the model itself. So that includes how it has been trained, and it also includes the positionality of that company. So really, in the end, what we kind of found was that there are differences in how journalists and news audiences are perceiving these risks. So journalists were quite likely to identify the risks of AI use within the organisation. That includes the challenges of implementing that technology, the pace of AI development, internal conflicts of opinion, lack of overarching policy, the difficulty of achieving coherence across generative AI, and also their vulnerability to regulation. But for audiences, they were locating those harms within journalism and also within society. So they were interested in journalistic credibility, democracy and accountability, privacy and model security, as Michelle discussed, and also the quality of the social and emotional dimensions of news. So particularly these ideas of like beauty standards in society, etc. I will leave it there and I'll go back to Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take us briefly through some of the news audience's expectations when it comes to the operations of news organisations when it comes to AI. So we asked news audience members what their expectations for journalism were when it came to AI, and we found a number of primary and secondary expectations. So the primary ones, there were 4 of them. essentially, these are things that we can talk about when later when TJ talks about the questions. But essentially, news or outlets should have guidelines in place governing how AI can be used. Journalists should be transparent in AI use. Journalists should verify AI content, and none of that's surprising given what we've seen, heard so far. But journalists and news outlets should use AI as little as possible. That was one of the overarching themes. And I want to unpack that a little bit because this wasn't some kind of Luddite technological resistant perspective. It was more from participants' desires to ensure the authenticity of journalistic content and valuing human labour and creativity, as Phoebe said. So they sought uses that complemented or augmented human labour rather than supplanted it. And you can see with this quote here from one of our participants, at this stage it's impossible to say we shouldn't have AI and AI should never exist. And I'm not saying there's no capacities where it's ever useful, because that's a big blanket statement, but I would really want to see its use absolutely minimised, particularly in terms of replacing people's jobs that work in newsrooms and also creating images and writing texts that then go on the news. And I don't think what's presented to the public should involve AI at the final end stages. I don't like that at all. Yeah, quite a few comments along those lines. Secondary expectations were the kinds of things that were raised by some audience members, but not all. But I think taken collectively, their frequency, they sit together. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but yeah, I wanted to point out a few important ones. AI policy should dynamically evolve, so a recognition that these aren't static, that these are dynamic place. Humans should be kept in the loop when using AI. Ask the person represented if AI can be used to edit their image. We see news reporting focused on some of that. I think having mode-specific AI policies and also having industry-wide rather than newsroom-specific AI policies was something people talked about a bit. Don't let AI sensationalise news content for clicks and taps. Don't let AI influence how journalists think about what they report on. Train AI internally on journalistic content, which is becoming a lot easier. Only let those with training use AI tools and punish those who misuse AI tools. And working in an academic setting, we know how challenging that is. So yeah, stay tuned on that. Use AI to check for biases and opinions and independence. So there's some things to think about as TJ takes us through some questions for journalists and news audiences to consider that have arisen from this work. Thanks, TJ.
All right, team. So we ended our report with a list of 9 questions. And I want to leave enough time for Q&A, so we might not get through all 9, but we'll try to get through a few and have a little bit of a chat with some of these questions for us to consider as industry folks, as scholars and academics, or as news audience members. Some questions for journalists and news organizations. So the first of these is whether news organizations should adopt kind of universal all or nothing policies or more kind of context specific or case-by-case policies. And on one hand, I think we can perhaps see that all or nothing rules are really attractive because they're really efficient. And so deadline-driven journalists, don't necessarily have time to spend minutes or hours contemplating, philosophizing about whether this use kind of adheres with the policies and the values and the principles of journalism. They're oftentimes really time poor and deadline driven. And so all or nothing rules are nice for that perspective in that regard. But on the other hand, they can be kind of constraining. They can kind of hinder innovation. They can also kind of tie journalists' hands behind their back in certain ways. So for example, some of our news audience participants said, we think that news organizations should never use AI visuals, for example. That's kind of that universal, never using AI images kind of logic. But in that case, there can be hidden kind of caveats and implications of that. For example, if you as a journalist or news outlet come across some content that's visual, that's viral, that has misinformation or disinformation in it, then you're not able to report on or fact check that content because you'd be republishing it. So if you have that kind of really clear line in the sand, no AI visuals, does that mean that you couldn't fact check a report on AI visuals that have misinformation in them? So some interesting things to consider in terms of how kind of broad or specific your policies should be. We also had very levels of comfort with temporality. People felt more comfortable with using AI to visualize and depict the past or the future compared to the present. And that might or might not be logical. So is that a rational, logical kind of comfort level to have, that we're more comfortable using AI to visualize things long ago or things in the future compared to things in the present? A lot of really interesting work being done right now on transparency and how to get the information to audiences when and where and how something has been, if at all, used with AI. That's one of our questions as well, and we have more information about that in the report. I think this one is a really important thing in terms of risk and risk management for journalists and news organizations. As the industry in some parts of the world contracts and changes and transforms, we're seeing more and more integration of third-party content into journalistic reporting. You'll see social media things being embedded into content. You'll see eyewitness vision and crowdsourced material kind of being integrated into journalistic reporting. And I think a lot of newsrooms and a lot of journalists don't necessarily have the feel well equipped to be able to verify and see the production or editing circumstances of the content that they're then kind of vouching for and putting their credibility behind when they're republishing it as journalists or news organizations. So I would kind of encourage news organizations and journalists to think about how well equipped are you to deal with content that you don't have any idea how it was made or edited. What are your kind of processes and steps and workflows to work with that kind of content as you are integrating it and putting it into your reporting? Questions about responsibility. So this is oftentimes a really tricky thing because not all journalistic content is bylined. You don't have necessarily a byline or an attribution for every different element or part of a journalistic output. Sometimes the content is just staff byline, just New York Times or Guardian or a particular person's name on it. Is it the person who has the name on the top of the article or piece of content? Is it an editor or manager? The news organization itself? Some really unanswered questions sometimes about who's responsible for AI in journalism. From our interviews, news audiences don't have a great understanding or awareness of news outlets' policies. So even the news outlets that do have policies, a lot of news audiences, we would argue, don't have that awareness or understanding of what the policies are or how they affect news audiences. So I think if we can take a little bit of a different example here, if we pop out to the grocery store and look at food packaging, you have consistent labels that show the nutritional value and content of each different type of food product that you want to buy. And each of these different products is potentially made by different companies, but they've come to some kind of agreement and standardization across the industry to say we're going to have consistency with how we label nutrition values or lack thereof on these food packaging items. We don't have this right now in journalism, but is it possible to try to work across news organizations to come to some consistent core minimum standards that we want to adopt to try to say, here's how we're using AI as an industry safely and responsibly? We think this might, if folks are able to kind of work across newsrooms, this might help prevent government interference in regulation if journalists and news organizations can regulate themselves and get kind of together and say, here's what we're going to do this kind of work. Number 7 of our questions. So oftentimes if news organizations have policies, they might not be public. If they are public, they're kind of written in legalese, in a very dense kind of terms of service-ish language. And news audiences don't ever see them. So how kind of transparent are they? How public are they? How aware of news audiences or news organizations' policies are news audiences? We've kind of touched on this one already, this 8th question earlier. We were looking at the image feature recognition use case, where folks in Europe were concerned that journalists and news organizations might need to have the consent of people depicted in images for an AI to process their likeness, their depiction. So there's lots of different ways that this can work. There's also implications for gathering this consent, for storing it on deadline, but also kind of for privacy purposes down the road. Lots of interesting questions here about consent and comfort with that being captured. And lastly, we think about kind of how does the use or non-use of AI by journalists and news organizations tie back to or relate to broader ethical or public interest commitments, for example, around combating climate change. So we know that generative AI is a resource-intensive and costly technology. There's been research that suggests that it takes as much energy to generate an image using AI as it does to fully charge a smartphone. and that it costs about 36 US cents to process every ChatGPT request. So there's a tangible environmental and or monetary cost for AI use, and we would encourage organizations to think about their use and if that helps or hurts larger society in these ways in terms of climate change and that kind of thing. So those are our 9 questions that we're ending our report with. We also have a nice little appendix here in the report at the very back of the report that shows some of the currently published research we already have on this topic, some of our public writing, some other folks' public writing, as well as some other key research that we think folks should read and consider and engage with. If there are journalists in the room or online who don't yet have an AI policy in their newsrooms, this second bullet pointer from the Poynter Institute in the States in Florida might be a good starting point. They have a little bit of a template you can use to try to think about some questions around developing your organization's first AI policy. If folks are already kind of further along in the game with the AI policy development space, that first bullet point might be more interesting, where it has a bit of a comparative global sense of news outlets' policies across different countries. You can kind of compare for yourself how your organization's policy might compare to different policies of outlets around the country. And for folks in Australia, we've already mentioned that UTS report looking at industry practice in AI and journalism. That's also a nice thing to look at as well. So if you haven't already read the report or have access to it, you can get it by looking at bit.ly/GenAI in journalism. That is case sensitive there, but you can download the report there. We also have an article and conversation coming out today on this that summarizes some of our findings for a late audience.